This is a recording from a Sunday meeting of the BC Humanists Association in Vancouver. Humanism is a progressive worldview that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead meaningful, ethical lives capable of adding to the greater good of humanity. To learn more about humanism and to support our work, visit bchumanist.ca and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and be sure to subscribe to the BC Humanist podcast. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of our staff or board of directors.
Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, David Barsamian. He's going to be talking from his book, Global Discontents, Rising Threats to Democracy. I'm sure many of you know David's history, but let me read a little bit here so you really appreciate the great thing that he served. One of America's most tireless and wide-ranging investigative journalists, David Barsamian has altered the independent media landscape, both with his weekly radio show, Alternative Radio, now in his 34th year, wow, and his books with Noam Chomsky, Iqbal Ahmed, Howard Zinn, Tariq Ali, Richard Wolff, Arundhati Roy, and Edward Said, I believe. His latest books are with Noam Chomsky, Global Discontents, Rising Threats to Democracy, and a new edition with Edward Said, Culture and Resistance. He is winner of the Media Education Award, the ACLU's Upton Sinclair Award for Independent Journalism, and the Cultural Freedom Fellowship from Lenan Foundation. The Institute for Alternative Journalism named him one of its top 10 media heroes. It's always good to know a hero. That's great. He is the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center and the South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy. He has collaborated with the world-renowned Cronus Quartet in events in New York, London, Vienna, and San Francisco. And to plug your radio show, which is kind of cool, Alternative Radio airs on CFRO, that's a Vancouver station, 100.5 FM on Tuesdays from noon until 1 o'clock. So please welcome David Barsamian to our meeting today. David?
Well, good morning, brothers and sisters, comrades. It's wonderful to see your beautiful, smiling faces here on this rainy Sunday morning in Vancouver. Thanks to Dan for coordinating this effort. I just want to make one correction. CFRO, which is at 100.5 FM, just moved alternative radio to Thursday mornings at 9. So from 9 to 10 a.m. every Thursday, you can hear the live broadcast. And then you can go to, if you have this technical facility, you can go to the Alternative Radio website, or you can go to the CFRO website, and they archive the audio there. So if you miss it, that's one way to do that. Before we start, I want to hand out a sign-up sheet so that I can keep in touch with you and you can find out more about Alternative Radio. But there is one stipulation, and that is you have to write clearly. Often when I go back to Boulder, I can't read half the names or the email addresses. And please be, confident I'm not going to share this with CSIS because they already have all your information. So this will just be for Alternative Radio, and if you don't want to sign, that's fine too. There you go. Well, where does one start? With your election tomorrow? That's a really interesting thing happening that will have a big impact directly on this province and on this country. Or do we want to talk a little bit about the shenanigans going on in that country just below Canada? It's a pretty large country. I was thinking more of Guatemala or El Salvador, smaller countries that are insignificant, that do not have any kind of global footprint, and is exemplified by extreme humility and modesty, particularly with the great leader now sitting in the oral orifice, also known as the Oval Office. I never know which one it is. He just passed his 1,000th day in office, in the orifice. And the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, which means Amazon, has been compiling a list of fabrications, prevarications that the great leader, I hesitate to even utter his name because, he's such an awe-inspiring figure. In the first 1,000 days of his regime in Washington, there have been 13,000 documented prevarications. I use that word prevarication not to show off my vocabulary, but then there's usually one person in an audience that doesn't know what it means, and that gives me the chance to say what it means in plain English. Lies. Yes, we have someone who is lying on a rate that, any Canadian hockey fan would be impressed with. 13,000 in 1,000 a day. That's a pretty good clip. You'd have to work very hard to match that level of lying that is being generated. So we have a very chaotic situation in that republic to your south. And it promises to get even more chaotic and more perilous in the coming months as this impeachment inquiry moves forward. It's unlikely that the great prevaricator, as I call him, will be convicted in the Senate, at least until now. The U.S. has a very screwed up kind of system, unlike Canada, right? In terms of how do we get rid of someone in office that is guilty of crimes, high crimes and misdemeanors, malfeasance, corruption, whatever it may be. There are articles of impeachment that are drawn up in the lower house, that is to say the House of Representatives or the Congress. And then that information is passed to the Senate, where there is a trial. There's an impeachment trial. Now, there are a couple of you here, actually, just a couple, that remember in 1998, another American president was impeached, but was not convicted in the Senate. And that was for, a picadillo, which he readily acknowledged later. The crimes committed by this particular occupant on the White House are simply off the scale, and by any historical measurement is absolutely breathtaking and jaw-dropping, from enriching himself and his business brand, Trump Towers Resort. Well, I said his name, but that's the buildings, the golf courses, the fancy hotels, and all of that. Still enriching himself, through contracts and people currying favor with him. Now, you have to ask yourself the question, I think we ask ourselves the question in the U.S., how could someone so singularly unfit, so singularly unqualified, be elected to be the leader of the free world? We can talk more about how free the free world is a bit later, if you like. And I think we have to be pretty ruthless and caustic in our analysis. That is to say, the great prevaricator tapped into certain impulses very deep in the soil in the United States. Impulses of xenophobia, of racism, of homophobia, of patriarchy. All of these things are not very far below the surface in the U.S. And along comes someone who is a television personality. For 14 years, he had a program called The Apprentice, in which the climactic ending was, "You're fired." And so he had an enormous amount of name recognition. But the backdrop, I think, needs to be explored in terms of understanding, how could 63 million of my fellow citizens turn out to vote for someone of this, objectively speaking, very low character and very low capabilities. And again, I think, you have to go to what has happened to not just the U.S. economy, but I suspect in Canada as well, since the introduction of neoliberal economics. I think that's the key. Yes, there is racism, there's xenophobia, there is patriarchy, But what has happened to people's incomes and their standard of living over the last 40 years, because that's when neoliberalism was introduced, has had an enormous negative impact on people's lives, particularly in the U.S. So neoliberalism, this is the very quick description of it, involves a massive deregulation. So before, when we had government agencies that were there to protect the people against corporate corruption and faulty products like planes that, don't respond to software changes. Boeing is going through that right now. And other, chemicals in our food, GMOs, and all of those other things. There was supposed to be regulations to protect the people from that. They have largely been eliminated under neoliberalism. This is to make it, the proponents of this do this, to make it easy for business, for our great entrepreneurs to make more money, to innovate, to create more jobs. This is the propaganda that accompanies that we're making life easier for people who then will make our lives easier. But in fact, they have enriched themselves in the 4 decades of neoliberalism. In the United States alone, it has seen the greatest transfer of wealth from the 99% to the 1%. So there has been a huge transfer of wealth from the have-nots to the super haves, let's say, the haves and the have-nots. And then there are these tax loopholes in the U.S. There's all kinds of tax breaks. There's, the probability of more and more privatization, cuts in benefits, in healthcare, in daycare centers, in dental care, all of these other things people depend on in the U.S. There's been a rollback in the quality of life for many, many people. So given that background, then you have someone come along who has enormous name recognition and orange hair and is extremely wealthy, right? And so he comes along and, like charlatans throughout history, says, I feel your pain. I understand what you're going through. I'm going to fix it. And then, he carries out this campaign. We know why you are suffering. It's because of the immigrants. It's the Arabs. It's the people who want to come to our country and steal our jobs and rape our women and, create chaos here in the world's leading democracy. So the great prevaricator was very successful in convincing a lot of people that their problems are being caused not by elites, not by the 1%, not by Wall Street and the bankers and the hedge funds. And incidentally, I just learned this morning that Postmedia is the largest media conglomerate here in Canada. You all know about that, right? Postmedia. It's owned by a Wall Street hedge fund. I didn't realize that. Quite extraordinary. Your most powerful media conglomerate in Canada is owned and controlled by a Wall Street hedge fund. I mean, this is not good for democracy. This is not good for the communication needs of any society, much less Canada. In U.S., we have about 5 corporations that control most of the media. That is to say, TV, radio, newspapers, and magazines. Not a healthy situation for any democracy to have that kind of concentration of power. And again, one of the hallmarks of neoliberalism, since it was introduced around 1980, was more and more concentration in more and more industries. So take healthcare, for example, or pharmaceuticals. There have been mergers and takeovers, and so where there used to be a modicum of competition, there's now more monopoly control. Because these capitalists, and that's who they are, they're capitalist managers, they like to pretend, and their party line is, we love competition. That's what capitalism is all about. But in fact, they pursue policies to eliminate competition. They want monopoly control. Why? They can maximize profits. It's pretty elementary, but the corporate media in the U.S. don't report on this in any detail because they themselves are owned by large capitalist corporations. So this man, the orange-haired man, comes along who's very skillful at scapegoating, who has, according to his first or second wife, I'm not sure, I think it's Ivana Trump, she said that he had a copy of Hitler's speeches at his night table and would refer to them. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but you can see certain similarities between what happened in the Third Reich in the late 1920s and early 1930s and throughout, and what is going on here in the U.S. That is to say, propaganda becomes extremely dominant and sophisticated. So there is a drumbeat of messages repeated over and over again. Lock her up, build the wall, drain the swamp. Who will pay for the wall? Mexico will pay for the wall. Those kinds of messages repeated over and over again is right out of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda textbook. Goebbels was Hitler's propaganda minister, often described as a genius of propaganda. Have very simple messages and repeat them over and over again until people just, reflect them back. So yes, it's the immigrants, it's the Mexicans, it's the Arabs, it's the Muslims. Be afraid is the subtext because they're coming. They're coming to get you. They're coming to, to erode your standard of living. Now, this is again rather ironic since the economic policies of the ruling elite in the U.S. and probably in Canada as well has, generated enormous income and wealth inequality, not equality. We're moving in opposite directions from where there should be more equality. And that's a direct result of property, of propaganda, and the constant drumbeat of messages. So people ask me, is the U.S. heading toward fascism or, what's going on? There's already a whiff of fascism in the country below the 49th parallel. And that whiff is getting stronger by the day. People like me and my profession are called the enemy of the American people. That's right out of Stalin's mouth. I mean, this is coming right from the Politburo in the Kremlin in the 1930s, when anyone who was critical of the state or the leader of the state was immediately denounced as an enemy of the people. You have to watch the language here because it's extremely manipulative and, shapes people's opinions about the media, about, how society is organized, who benefits from the economic system as well. And Germany was no ordinary country. This is, of course, in the 1920s, Germany is at the peak of Western civilization. So we're not talking about some backwater, insignificant country in Central Asia or in Eastern Europe. We're talking about the most sophisticated society in the world at that time. Up to 75% of all scientific papers in the 1920s and early 1930s was written in German. It was the language of science. It was the language of theater, of Kurt Weill, of Bertolt Brecht, a great poet, literature, Thomas Mann and Franz Werfel. Germany was in architecture, the Gropius school of architecture, the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius, was the rage in Europe. So you had a very sophisticated country, very reasonable, excelling in the arts and the sciences, how could that country, within 3 or 4 years, descend into utter barbarism, into one of the cruelest and most violent regimes in history? So in that country to your south, people say, well, it can't happen here. It can happen here. It has happened here before. In fact, the population is so illiterate in terms of knowing history in the country I come from. They don't realize that when the great prevaricator says America first, that he's actually echoing a slogan from a neo-Nazi party in the 1930s that was led by Charles Lindbergh. So, a little history, as the great Howard Zinn, the radical historian and one of my mentors, would say, a little history can be a dangerous thing. Because if, as Santayana, the Spanish philosopher, said, if you don't know the past, then you're condemned to repeat it. And so we see how things change in a cyclical way. So what could happen and what did happen, not just in Germany, but in Italy, in Spain, is now happening in multiple countries around the world, including the United States of America. Look at Hungary. Look at Viktor Orban in Hungary. Look at the Czech Republic with Zeman. Look at Austria with Sebastian Ur. Look at India with Modi. Supposedly the world's largest democracy is run by a Hindu nationalist who is an Islamophobe, who has, permitted many atrocities against minorities. And basically, in the U.S., nobody knows about this because India has also a very successful propaganda machine operating that labels Pakistan as a terrorist state and India as a kind of a victim of terrorism. The same kind of narrative that we see in the Middle East. Israel is the victim of terrorism, and the Palestinians and the Arabs are the perpetuators of terrorism. So you have a complete flip around where the victim becomes the victimizer, and the victimizer is the victim. So just today, we see what's happening in terms of the Middle East, what's going on at the border with Syria and Turkey. I can, talk about this at length. It is supposed to be a great. The critics of the orange-haired man are saying this is a betrayal of U.S. values. Well, what hypocrisy! I mean, first of all, the Kurds have been sold out by the U.S. on multiple occasions. Most recently, in 1991, after the first Gulf War, when the U.S. encouraged the Kurds to rise up against Saddam Hussein, and they did, and then the U.S. didn't help them out at all, and they were slaughtered in great numbers. And now again, you see history repeating itself. Going back to America First, that was a neo-Nazi movement. Huey Long, who was an American fascist politician in the 1930s, he was governor of Louisiana, also a senator from that state. He once predicted that if fascism ever comes to the United States, I don't know if he said if or when. There's some controversy about that. Let's say when fascism comes to the United States, it'll be wrapped in an American flag inside a Bible. So you'll have, God and country and, patriotism, the flag, and all of that. So Chomsky, I just want to say, coming together is really important. So I'm glad that you have a place on Sundays to gather, to overcome isolation and, whatever, how we're atomized as a society, as citizens. Because power doesn't want people to get together. Power doesn't want a 16-year-old Swedish student coming to Edmonton and lecturing Canadians about the poisonous tar sands that this country is producing, or about the Kinder Morgan pipelines, or the Trans Mountain pipeline, and all the other things that liberal and conservative governments, have been doing in this country. Power wants you pacified. Power wants you isolated. Worry about, your next haircut. Should I go to that salon or this salon? My friend told me that in that salon, they also give a free manicure. So maybe I should go there. But, you don't want to be satisfied with a manicure. You want to get a pedicure too. And that salon will do it over there. So these are the kinds of choices, we're offered. Should I buy this multigrain bread or this other bread? Should I buy the pumpernickel or the rye? Consumerism becomes the dominant ideology, and then people are not thinking about society, about what's going on in Ottawa, or what's really going on in Washington, D.C. So Chomsky says it's very important for institutions of concentrated power to keep people alone and isolated. That way, that means we, are ineffective. They can't defend themselves against indoctrination and propaganda. They can't even figure out what's going on. As long as the general population is passive, apathetic, diverted to consumerism or hatred of the vulnerable, then the powerful can do as they please. So this, probably is valid for Canada as well. There's an enormous amount of attention paid to, let's say, the Kardashians, or to the National Hockey League, or to other, diversions, the Canadian Football League. Sports is a kind of, replaces religion for a lot of people as an opiate of the masses. People in the U.S., for example, know more about their baseball teams than they know about than what their representatives in Washington are doing on their behalf. So you have these, what I call the media as a weapon of mass distraction. It needs to be regulated. I think corporate control media pose a serious health problem to the well-being of society. Because if all you're getting is a pack of lies wrapped in consumerisms and slogans about patriotism, people have no idea what's going on and then are easily manipulated and controlled. Now, Ursula Le Guin was a great writer. I say was. She passed away a couple of years ago. She said, we live in capitalism. I mean, that's the economic system that exists in the U.S. and in Canada. Its power seems inescapable, Le Guin said. But then, she added, so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. That is to say, this situation is not inevitable. This is not something genetic that we cannot change. We can change the economic system. We can change the political system to be more responsive to people's needs. Do you have a housing crisis here in Vancouver? There's something called, it's laughable, affordable housing. It hardly exists. This extends into the U.S., of course, Seattle, San Francisco, more recently in Denver, Boulder, where I live, Boulder, Colorado. Affordable housing has become a real crisis for many, many people. What a shame it is to drive past Hastings in the east end of Vancouver and see not tens, not scores, but hundreds and hundreds of people sleeping out in the open. Where if you walk on the sidewalk, you see syringes, that have been tossed by drug users. A harrowing, very, and I'm not dissing you, as Canadians. It's worse in the U.S. It's much, much worse. Go to Southern California, go to Portland, go to Seattle. Tens of thousands. New York City, my hometown, 70,000 homeless people. 70,000 people every night sleep out in the open or under a bridge or under an overpass. This is in the richest country in the history of the world. Canada is not that far behind in terms of, actual wealth. In fact, in terms of mineral wealth, unfortunately, your country is number one in the world in extraction of minerals. And often this extraction of minerals is accompanied by enormous human rights violations in Central America, in Mexico, in Papua New Guinea, and in many other places that most Canadians don't even know about. The minimum figure I've seen is that 60% of all major mining operations in the world are Canadian controlled. On the high end, that figure is 75%. So let's go with the low end one, 60%. So here's a country of less than, 35 million people? 35 million people with 60% control of 60% of the world's extraction industries. Now, you might say, well, isn't that a good thing for Canada? Well, it's a good thing for the corporate bottom line of Barrick Golding and these other big mining corporations. But knock, knock, there is an eco-crisis going on in the world. There is enormous damage being done to our mother, the environment. It's under attack by these corporations who are extracting more and more wealth, using, incidentally, tons and tons of fresh water. This is particularly true in fracking, which is a different extractive industry. I don't know if you have that here in Canada. It's like pandemic in the U.S. I mean, you can't drive anywhere without seeing these enormous drills, which pump in huge amounts of fresh water. So that has contributed to global warming, to the eco-crisis that we are facing as a society in toto. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the fierce urgency of now. Around this issue, which is planetary survival, is that kind of a marginal issue? Is it planetary survival, the future? You have children, you have grandchildren, you have friends, you have many connections. What kind of future are we preparing for them if we continue on this path of extracting, attacking, assaulting Mother Nature as if there's no tomorrow, all in the name of accumulating wealth? Marx, not Groucho, Harpo, or Chico, but the other one, with a K, Karl, German spelling, he talked about the werewolf, this is a direct quote, the werewolf hunger of capitalists. Almost like a werewolf. They're almost bloodthirsty. Anything to maximize profit, no matter the damage to society. That's somebody else's problem. I'm a CEO of a big Canadian corporation. My loyalty is to you, my shareholders. You bought stocks in my company because you want dividends. So my institutional role is to provide you with the profits that I am generating. That's the Faustian bargain. And what happens to the environment down the line, that's somebody else's problem. I'm out of here. I'm closer to the end than the beginning as it is. I'm almost 75. So if I'm that CEO, that's the institutional push to keep this insane situation continuing. Why do I call it insane? Why would a civilization undermine its own future? We are now in the 6th extinction. Species are being eliminated, are dying off at unprecedented, rates. And this is not just about cute penguins and polar bears and walruses, up in the Arctic or in, the Canadian North. It's going to be about us very soon. So that there's no sense of urgency. Now, I'm hopeful that because of brave young people like Greta Thunberg and also many others who have joined them in the Sunrise Movement, in Extinction Rebellion, in 350.org, and many other eco groups in this country and in the U.S. and around the world, that, the elders who are supposed to be the font of wisdom and experience will wake up and pay attention to what's happening to our mother. If your literal mother were under attack, would you just stand by and watch? Would you just make some, I was, into the Maple Leafs. They were playing in overtime and I was watching the game. So I really couldn't bother. I'm sorry, my mother's getting attacked. Maybe she provoked somebody. Maybe she said somebody. What? Are you going to straddle the fence? Or are you going to, you're going to do the right thing? You're going to rush to your mother's assistance. It's like a no-brainer. So our mother is under attack. It's under siege. And we have to protect it for the future of the planet and for the future generation. And, you have these teenagers now wagging their fingers at you. What are you doing? What have you done? What kind of future are you promising for me to have? Just because you wanted to have, that extra McMansion. So in the U.S., we have these, there's an enormous housing crisis. There's also an enormous amount of speculation in housing, which I think is going on in Vancouver as well. That is to say, absentee landlords, who buy up condos and buildings and buy houses, as investments, and they're vacant most of the time because the owners are sitting, somewhere else, maybe even in the U.S. Same thing's going on inside of U.S. cities as well. Huge amount of speculation in real estate and in housing. We in the U.S. have aircraft carrier battle groups. We have F-35 fighter jets. We have Trident submarines. We have nuclear weapons, not very far from the border, by the way. Do you know Bremerton in Washington? It's a naval base there. The bad joke is that if Bremerton were an independent country, it would be the third largest nuclear power in the world after the United States and Russia. Just Bremerton alone, with all the Trident submarines there, which have nukes. What if there's an accident there? Have you forgotten 3 Mile Island? Has Fukushima been forgotten? There's a Hanford reactor on the Columbia River. Again, not very far from the Canadian border, that has been leaking radioactive materials into the Columbia River. So this is, a huge, side issue. I don't want to, try and minimize its importance. Survival of the species, I think, should be a topic that should generate an enormous amount of interest and attention. And when you have political leaders, as I've heard in this country from, almost across the spectrum, and certainly in the U.S., they obfuscate the reality by throwing this thing of jobs at people. Well, it's jobs. If we stop drilling, if we stop extracting the tar sands, we're gonna lose jobs. The fact of the matter is, if you invest in sustainable energies of wind and solar, you will create many more jobs than exist in the U.S. in the military-industrial complex, but also in the petroleum and minerals extraction industries in this country and in the U.S. as well. Building schools, building roads, protecting the environment, building recreation centers, providing universal health care, providing free education. This will create more jobs and more real wealth for the general population, not for the sliver that is, making money hand over fist. So getting organized is really important. Now you have a group here. I don't know what kind of actions you may undertake as a group. It's great to be, as an individual, but when you have numbers, you have power. And Bill McKibben, who's a great U.S. activist, he started 350.org. Just to have a little plug, there's a new magazine called The Sun that comes out of North Carolina. In the current issue, I have an interview with Bill McKibben. And, He's a very interesting guy. He started 350.org, which now has hundreds of thousands of members, across the world, on his living room floor with a handful of students. That's how change has always started. Like the women's movement in the United States started in 1846 or 8, I'm not sure. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and 4 or 5 women got together and said, we demand our rights. We can't vote. We can't own property. We don't have a right to divorce. We don't get inheritance. That was the beginning of that movement. So all movements for social change start with a few people and then grow and expand. And when you find kindred spirits, you overcome this loneliness and isolation, as I referred to, and atomization that, power wants to inculcate in you. You just give up, so you worry about, will the Canucks get into the playoffs this year or not? And, how does Kwame Leonard leaving the Raptors affect the Raptors' chances of winning the NBA title again? Worry about those things, weapons of mass distraction. By the way, I just want to acknowledge that a comrade walked in, Joseph Roberts, who's standing right here. He's the publisher and editor of the wonderful newspaper magazine called Common Ground. Have you seen it around? You can get great information from this magazine. In fact, there's a terrific article on Leonard Cohen, who's one of your great cultural gems that I admire enormously, who passed away a year or two ago. So talk to Joseph afterwards, and I'm sure you could get a free copy of Common Ground into your hands. And we are connected in terms of exchanging information. I send him things, he sends me things, and that's the way movements grow. That's how we overcome isolation and atomization. So let's see. Well, God, it's already 11:15. I want to give you one example of something extraordinary that happened in a country that I'm a little bit familiar with, and that is the Republic of Armenia. I'm sure there are many Armenian speakers here today. You all look Armenian, particularly you, yeah. It's a small, landlocked, very poor country, under 3 million people. It's locked in the Caucasus. It's surrounded by enemies. I mean, people that really, wish them harm to some extent. That is to say, Turkey and Azerbaijan. So they're in a very difficult situation. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, what happened? Not just the hammer and sickle came down, but the commissars, the communists, just changed their clothes. And they carried on business the way they did before. Corruption, cronyism, favoritism, contracts to their friends, and that kind of thing. So all of these now liberated, independent, free countries like Belarus, like Kazakhstan, like Tajikistan, like Armenia, like Georgia, like Azerbaijan, Estonia, all of them, they lapsed into a kind of new corporate capitalism. So the communists just changed their suits, parted their hair in a different way, but carried on business as usual. And Armenia was no different. I was there in the Soviet period, and then I was there in 2017. And I speak Armenian, so that allows me a little more insight into what's going on in the country. I encountered a lot of discontent. People were very angry. I mean, this spontaneously would tell you, as an outsider, as a U.S. person of Armenian origin, we hate the government, they're corrupt, they're ripping us off, everything is rigged, elections are a joke, big money controls everything. Kind of sounds like the U.S. to some extent. But, and then what happened? A member of parliament, not fairly well known, his name was Nikol Pashinyan, he decided, maybe thinking of Mahatma Gandhi's Salt March, he decided to walk across Armenia. Now, you may think, wow, this is really, impressive. It's a very small country. So it's not something, out of the realm of possibility. And like Gandhi's Salt March in 1930, in each town that he passed through, more and more people joined the walk. Finally, they reached the capital city of Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, and the numbers are in the hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands. This is in a country with less than 3 million people. Hundreds of thousands of people in the street demanding change, demanding justice, shutting down the airport, shutting down the railroad, the main railroad station, and all the metro was shut down. Basically, the whole country was in a lockdown, people demanding change, demanding justice. And you know what? It happened. The government fell. Pashinyan became the prime minister. It's not to say it's not without its problems, but it's a much better situation than it was before. So people power still matters. We've seen that in Tunisia in the last week where there's been an election. It was Tunisia that had a poor street vendor in December of 2010. His name was Mohamed Bouazizi. In the town of Bouaziz in Tunisia, he burned himself to death because he had been insulted and humiliated by government officers who were putting the squeeze on him. They were, asking for bribes. And he went to the ministry demanding justice. He was totally ignored. He killed himself. That sparked the Tunisian revolution. Within 3 weeks, an entrenched dictatorship of 22 years was overthrown. Ben Ali, that the U.S. supported right till the very end. You say it can't happen? Change can happen when people organize and demand their rights. That's why community is so important. That's why organizations are so important. So Bill McKibben, that I was referring to earlier, I'm coming back in a circle here, he says at every talk he gives, he's always asked the same question. The first question from the audience is, what can I do? And right away, Bill says, you've got the wrong pronoun. Get rid of the I and substitute we, because it has to be collective. It has to be, it has to be a larger group to have an impact. So what can we do? What can you do as a group? I'm not going to tell you what to do. We have enough problems, dealing with the rise of crypto-fascism in the U.S. and the potential of, a possible coup next year. I'm not overstating the case here. When you have someone who is as unstable as the current occupant of the oral orifice is, and when you have a mindless, largely evangelical group behind him that is following him. Have any of you seen Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl? A masterwork of propaganda. It's the 1934 Nazi Congress in Nuremberg. Riefenstahl was a favorite filmmaker of the Nazis. Goebbels adored her. She was given all kinds of facilities to do documentary films to promote the Nazi ideology. She was also an enormously talented cinematographer. And she made this film about the Nazi Party Congress. Now, why do I say that? Because just before I came here, I was watching the orange-haired man speaking in Dallas, Texas, to a large crowd of people, and though the look on their faces was identical to the look you will see if you look at this documentary. It's on YouTube, by the way. You can watch it for free. Triumph of the Will, it's called. Leni Riefenstahl. The exact same look that those Hitler worshippers had in the 1930s in Germany, the Americans in Dallas had the same glazed over eyes and worshipful, as if they were in the presence of the Lord Almighty herself, right? Very, very interesting to see parallels. And, again, why does this happen? Because those kinds of mobs, the crowd, as Elias Canetti, the brilliant Italian sociologist, would talk about, the crowd gives those people who are fairly marginalized a sense of identity. I belong to a movement. I'm a Trumpista. I'm part of, something that's going to save this country and save civilization, save us from socialism, and other, collectivist ideologies. So it's really, I think, instructive, again, to look at the past and see how the past resonates in the present. And the crowd, there's a word in German, it's called Gemeinschaft. It gives a sense of union to people who are otherwise broken, who are otherwise, as I said, marginalized. So I'm not just Joe Schmo or Jane Schlemiel. I'm somebody. I'm part of a movement, and that gives me identity and strength. This is how dictatorships form. This is how tyrannies are built, on exploiting the most vulnerable sectors in a society that are not well educated, that are not, well informed. That if people ask me all the time, how are the Americans falling for all this? Well, if your diet is Breitbart News and Fox and Red State and InfoWars and other conspiracy theories, you're going to have a pretty narrow view of the world, and skewed way to the right. I see that kind of media as posing a real public health crisis. It is poisoning people's minds. It is dividing and carrying out what dictatorships have always done and empires have always done, divide and rule. You're suffering because of the blacks. You're suffering because of the Mexicans. You're suffering because of the Chinese. Blame someone else. Do not focus on what is actually happening. So those groups are being manipulated. And people stand up. People do resist. I know I'm going over time here, but do you remember Pastor Martin Niemöller? Some of you don't know his name. You'll know his famous poem, First They Came For. Now, who was Martin Niemöller? It's a very interesting background. He was a decorated U-boat officer in World War I. After the war, maybe because of his experiences, I don't know, he becomes a Lutheran minister, practicing Lutheran minister, and a member of the anti-Nazi resistance. And he wrote a famous poem, First They Came For the Communists and Socialists, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a communist and a socialist. I'm going to change that in a second. And he paid a huge price. I mean, because he was a war hero, they didn't execute him, but he was in Sachsenhausen and Dachau concentration camps from 1937 to 1945. Do you know about the White Rose movement in Germany? A couple of kids at the University of Munich at the height of Nazi power, 1941, 1942, when it really looked like Germany was going to win the war and that Hitler was invincible, they got a printing press and started rolling off leaflets and articles, criticizing the regime. And the famous graffiti on the walls of the University of Munich was that every word that comes out of Hitler's mouth is a lie. Well, we can say that about somebody sitting in the Oval Office right now in Washington, D.C. They were arrested, they were tortured, they were executed. That's standing up, against tremendous odds. As I said, I'm not going to lecture Canadians, but in the U.S., we're not facing, the Gestapo, at least not yet. We're not facing concentration camps. We still have an enormous amount of space to operate in. So we should be doing that. We should be engaging and not straddling the fence, not saying, well, I can't get involved. It's very complicated. It's not complicated. You have a tyrannical ruler who is dedicated to maximizing profits for himself and his corporate cronies at the expense of the planet and the rest of civilization. That's our situation in the U.S. So it behooves us to take action inside the belly of the beast. You're outside the belly. You can do a lot here in Canada. You might think about, a fewer trips to the U.S. just to, buy milk or gasoline or, take cheaper flights from Seattle or whatever, the rationale is. And I'm sure there are many reasons to go to the U.S. to go shopping. Okay, we're going to wind up. So Martin Niemöller, in a modern sense, first they came for the Arabs. I didn't say anything. I wasn't an Arab. Then they came for the Muslims. I didn't say anything. I wasn't a Muslim. Then they came for the liberals and the socialists. I wasn't a liberal. I wasn't a socialist. I didn't say anything. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up. So that's the moment. We're in a Martin Niemöller type of moment where we must stand up and speak out. Now, I want you to, get these books. I'm sorry to make a little commercial diversion here, but I think the real bargain are these 4 CDs of Nick Estes. You won't know who he is, a brilliant First Nations scholar activist in the U.S. I just recorded him in Denver last week. Indigenous Peoples Resistance. We can learn a lot from First Nations. We can learn a lot from Native Americans in terms of venerating and respecting the earth. As Chief Seattle supposedly once said, we belong to the earth. The earth does not belong to us. But the capitalists believe it belongs to them. And so they are, constantly thinking about it as a giant Costco. They see the planet as a giant Safeway, where they go in, loot, destroy, and leave, and then let someone else clean up the mess. There's a great line in The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. He said, they were sloppy people. They threw things everywhere and destroyed everything because they always knew there was someone would come along to clean up after them. It's an interesting book about capitalism written in the early 1920s. Kianga Yamata Taylor, you won't know who she is probably, African-American activist, The Power of Social Movements. It's a great program. And this is a 2 CD set I did with Vijay Prashad of India on history and politics. It's about Kashmir. It's about Palestine. It's about the environment. It's about propaganda. 2 CDs. So all 4 of these are here available for $25. So end of commercial message. Buy the books and the CDs. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. After listening to your speech, I feel discouraged and inspired all at the same time.